Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. is in conversation with John Hawthorne. John is a sociologist who spent nearly 4 decades in Christian higher education. He served as faculty member and academic administrator over the course of his career, spending time in 5 different Christian universities. He writes a Substack that often deals with issues in Christian higher education and has been regularly interviewed for Christianity Today, Religion News Service, Sojourners, Inside Higher Ed, and the Associated Press. His publications include A First Step into a Much Larger World, The Christian University, and Beyond. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
All right. Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am actually joined live and in person with John Hawthorne and dogs, recording from my house. So if there's some dog noise in the background, please forgive us. John, anything else you want to say about yourself?
So the reason I live here is that our daughter and family, our daughter came to grad school at DU in a couple of decades ago, and met her husband, and then they have 2 girls and settled in a neighborhood. And so I retired in May of 2020, in the throes of COVID. Mm-hmm. I went home on March the 13th and went back one day to pack my office.
Wow.
And, so then a year later, when things looked like they had calmed down a little bit, we sold the house in Michigan and were able to buy a house here and have the good fortune of living, 0.4 of a mile from my daughter's house. Walkable distance where, granddaughter can ride the bike over and that's been great. And I'm now the board president of my oldest grandchild's charter school in North Glen. So that keeps me kind of busy, but not terribly so.
Yeah.
I grew up in Indiana, and as we may get to, moved around a lot. Given my decision to be in Christian universities, mm-hmm. and more importantly, my decision to go into administration, which meant more mobility than kind of taking a teaching position and staying there for 35 or 40 years.
Right. Anything you want to say about your faith journey, what that looked like in the past, what that looks like today?
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep.
Sure.
Grew up in a kind of faith-adjacent home, mm-hmm. which meant my grandmother's kind of avid Presbyterianism, mm-hmm. But mostly not so much. But through influence of friends and other things, I became a Christian in high school. I actually flunked out of college after my first year, and went home at their request. And back in Indianapolis, wound up getting involved, at a church, a Nazarene church that was pretty fundamentalist even for Nazarene churches. And always felt that was good for me at the time, given lack of discipline and all the things that contributed to flunking out of school. And over the years, the notion of grace became more and more prominent, which is one of the reasons that I am a Methodist today, is that just notion of the free gift of grace kind of has kind of taken the place of that earlier, somewhat more, never really as good fundamentalist, but somewhat more fundamentalist leaning, is kind of the big transition, I think, of my faith journey. We bounced back and forth between Nazarene churches and Methodist churches, and then, upon moving, from California to Michigan, that was kind of we've been Methodist ever since and kind of owned that. But I've always been in more or less Wesleyan kind of big family spaces.
Yeah, because Nazarenes have a Wesleyan.
I was at a Church of God school, Church of God Anderson school, which also is there. I did spend a few years, the second institution I was at is Sterling College in Kansas, which is a Presbyterian school, but I went to the Methodist church. So, yeah.
Cool. Any spiritual practices that you really like to keep maintaining healthily?
Honestly, I'm not real good at that. I keep trying to kind of get into regular rhythms.
Practice practicing. Right?
Exactly. And they take for a bit and then they don't. Community is important, being with other people, kind of reflecting on what I'm reading, even if it's not, particularly a religious topic, is, kind of feeds that broader sense of understanding of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm fortunate to be talking again live and in person with John this morning as we're recording. And, we're talking about a little bit around his book. John's the author of The Fearless Christian University. No subtitle, right? No subtitle. He brought a copy. My copy's upstairs. But we're going to talk kind of around this topic and then more broadly around institutions, particularly Christian institutions in the church. But do you want to start off kind of just what led you to write the book, what inspired it?
So, as I just mentioned, I got into Christian higher education because my wife was a graduate of Olivet Nazarene, which was where my first job was. And so through her networks, I was known when I was in grad school, and they called up out of the blue and offered me a job. And so I went and taught there. But I learned I was there 9 years, and by the latter part of that period, I was kind of itching for something else more to do, and felt led. I think I could say that. I don't know if called is too strong, but definitely led to exercise some administrative gifts I thought I was sensing. And it wasn't going to happen there. So if I was going to pursue that, it required moving. I mean, they weren't like opposed to me. It was like the person who was my department chair was department chair another decade. And it was just like the amount of time necessary to wait to make that move was going to be endless. And so I moved and taught sociology at Sterling College in Kansas. Then in 2 years into that, the college had acquired a non-traditional program, one of those classes for working adults that meet at night, one night a week, and that actually operated in Missouri. But and I was the chair of the faculty committee that gave oversight to that. Well, the president fired the VP, and I became acting VP while they did a search. And then after they did a search, I became permanent VP, and I was VP for that from from late 92 through 95. And it had some challenges to it, but I was enjoying what I was doing. I thought, accomplishing the right kinds of things, but I didn't want to spend my career in non-traditional education. And I figured if I stayed too long, that was going to be a problem. Mm-hmm. And as it turned out, the president nominated me for an opening at Warner Pacific College in Portland, Oregon, which is a Church of God, Indiana, mm-hmm. Church of God Anderson, Indiana affiliated college. And I took the role of, the title eventually became Vice President of Faculty Affairs. And I did that for a decade. And then, spent a year in transition as assistant to the president, and then moved to Point Loma Nazarene in San Diego, where I was provost for 4 years. And that ended badly. And then, I wound up eventually in Michigan, back in the classroom, teaching sociology at Spring Arbor University Free Methodist School. Mm-hmm. So I knew I was retiring in May of 20, made that decision early on, the year before. And, 2 months before I retired, I sat down and I wrote myself a memo, 30-page double-spaced, on, well, here's how my career went. And as I looked over that memo, I said, oh, maybe there's something here. Maybe there would be a series of essays mm-hmm. that I could write about Christian higher education. And I actually met with one representative who happened to be here in Denver for the Evangelical Theological Society. And we had coffee, and I said, here's what I've got. And he said, my wife, who teaches at a Christian college, she'd like this. Huh. But I don't know how much of a bigger market there is than her. And I said, okay, fair enough. And so I kind of set that aside. But the first of those essays became the first chapter in Fearless Christian University. Mm. And what I wound up doing was writing what I came to see as the affirmative case for a different approach to Christian higher education, mm-hmm. rather than just, here were some important lessons from my past. Right. Those lessons you can still find through the pages of the book, but it shifted my focus, and I was able to speak to kind of a broader issue, which, as you say, I hope speaks to broader issues within the evangelical church, and to an extent the mainline church, and maybe to parachurch organization, all of it. Right. So
yeah. So let's get into that, because I think, again, your title is the Fearless Christian University, but I think this is more applicable. It seems like to me we're really in an era, perhaps, from my perspective, that fear, I think, runs everything. And I was thinking about this. I can't remember if it's in your book or if it's in another book I read, where they talk about how, like, the kind of worldview thing in evangelical universities has been like the kind of the boogeyman driver of, like, parents, you got to invest in your kids' worldview. And I feel like similarly in, like, mainline or progressive spaces now, it's like, Christian nationalism, like, that's the boogeyman. And not that these aren't, like, problematic things, especially today, Christian nationalism, but it seems like everything is kind of reactionary, fear-based, and you really try to, like, I guess, is that a fair?
I think broadly. Let me. Yeah. So here's how the first chapter begins.
Yeah.
Christian universities, much like the evangelical subculture that spawned them, are characterized by fear. Fear of societal decline, fear of secular authorities, fear of apostasy, fear of not being real schools. In short, they fear losing their way.
Yeah.
And I think that notion about, if we don't hold the line on every little thing, mm-hmm. on the Christian worldview, on the social ethic, on all these things, that everything will fall apart. I have to work to figure Christian nationalism. See, I think the Christian nationalism thing is also related to fear of social change.
Yeah.
So it's similar in that way, is some of what's fostering that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think one thing that was interesting in your book, and this title or phraseology doesn't come from you particularly, if Andy Crouch, but you used the term from him, zombie institutions. So talk like what that is, and then how do we go about revitalizing these institutions?
I meant to look up the scripture reference to get it right, but the paraphrase is the form of religion without the essence therein.
Sure.
Sure. And I think that's some of what Crouch was talking about. It is that institutions settle into patterns of being and behaving that have suited them in the past, and they have this perhaps bias toward inertia.
Mm-hmm.
And if the culture around them has changed or the internal dynamics have changed, they seem to be unaware of that because things run on autopilot. They just kind of know how to keep doing the thing they've always done. And every year looks like every other year. And so it's in that sense that I kind of talk about, in my case, particularly Christian universities who are simply kind of talking about the same issues, saying the same things in their admissions brochures, doing everything they've ever done. And that limits their ability to respond to what I argue is a very, to a very much changed cultural dynamic, among incoming college students and the broader culture.
Right.
And so maintaining that past practice, particularly either in a reactionary mode or at least in the zombie sense, in the non-reflective mode, it causes all kinds of problems.
So I think what's interesting for me, and again, you were writing primarily from the university context. I'm thinking about this for a church context, especially from my situation within the mainline world. But when I read the zombie institution thing, and you talk about this bias toward inertia, like I feel like, again, I haven't been part of mainline Christianity that long. I'm really in many ways an outside observer, so to speak, because of that. But it seems like to me that mainline Protestantism has been kind of just managing decline really, when you look at data from like a Ryan Burge or something, it's like managing decline for 20, 30, 40 years.
Actually 80, but
yeah, sure.
I mean, no, the peak was 1970.
Right.
And let me go on a detour.
Yeah.
The sociology of mainline churches. So back in post-war America, there is this sort of religious boom, part of which is a civil religious boom.
Right.
Church is a good thing.
Right.
This is where you get Eisenhower saying that our country makes no sense unless it's based on a deeply felt faith, and he doesn't care what that faith is. And so church became part of social acceptance, of affiliation, of recognition that you're a good member of the community. And that I think fostered the big growth in the main lines, which of course means the main lines were not true anymore, were demographically about a decade older than the evangelical churches, which explode in the late 70s through the 80s. There is evidence that the evangelicals are now hitting demographic plateaus and having their own issues. There was some sociological research that argued that mainline pastors got very much involved in social action issues, which created a gap with the population. There's some truth to that. I think what is more likely is that you have a traditional versus an experimental, innovative, so while the mainline church is still in the big old building downtown with the choir and the robes, the worship band is going on at the Evangelical Church, and they've got the youth group, and there is a cannibalization, I think, that happens as there's defection from the mainline to the evangelicals. Now the growth is non-denoms. But that's how I kind of think about what that looks like. One of the dynamics of that kind of historical pattern is that part of the evangelical strength, and this relates to the themes of the book, part of the evangelical identity is we're true believers. Those guys don't believe anything. And there may have been a period of time where mainline churches soft-sold theology, but I think that's generally a myth. And so what you find today in mainline churches, is this kind of broader social awareness blended with a community, both local and internal, and a kind of Jesus-centered theology. I was just, my wife and I went to, we went to St. Simon's Island, Georgia at the end of January for this event that Diana Butler Bass puts on. And it was great. It was very white, very middle class, but it was a 700 kind of well-meaning, faith-filled mainline folks. And it was really encouraging. I mean, it's just to counter that kind of, well, the mainlines don't stand for anything is really important.
Well, let's talk about that, because one of the things you note in the book that I feel like I've seen, broadly speaking, within American Christianity is this kind of like melding of Christianity into like the progressive wing and the conservative wing. And like in the conservative wing, like, because I think correct me if this is wrong, but I feel like even within like a tradition like the Church of the Nazarene that had distinct rituals and practices, there's kind of this melding into like just evangelicalism writ large. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. Certainly within mainline Protestantism, I feel like it's not quite as distinct, but there is kind of this kind of amalgamation into just like one sort of like, we're just liberal Christianity.
Okay, a couple of things.
What comes to you?
Yeah. There is a sense in which, one of the things that happens in the evangelical world first is that denominational publishing houses die. And they are replaced by whatever Rick Warren did lately, or whoever the hot person is now.
Now it's, I feel like Cokesbury is Adam
Cokesbury's still operating,
but there are like whatever Adam Hamilton, for instance,
exactly
wants to put out.
But they'll put that out. But that's different than when the Church of God Press dies, and then the Sunday school. I was at the Nazarene Church in Portland. And one year we were reading, they decided they kind of bought the subscription for everybody. So we were going to read the 40 Days of Purpose from Rick Warren. And you read the first page and say, this book is theologically not what we believe. but it's a big name and it's a popular book. I mean, everybody knows about it. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's reading all the stuff about it. And that replaces that kind of dynamic.
Right.
And so what's distinctive about a denomination kind of shrinks.
Yeah.
Now, your reference to, how do they, what do you do with kind of all of the kind of behavioral limitations that often went along with conservative evangelicalism? Those soften. I mean, it used to be there were no cards. You had to play cards. You'd go bowling. You'd go to circus.
I was just telling the kids, like when we grew up, Karina, wife and I, like we couldn't go to movies in Bible college.
And, now, it's like wine with dinner. Sure. Who cares? Right. I mean, it's, except that there's been a move in the last 5 years for conservative denominations to double down on LGBTQ issues.
Yeah.
Because what they've done is they said, these positions that we held, these social positions, they're doctrinal.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden they have just shut down conversation around the topic. Mm-hmm. They don't do that around alcohol. They don't do that around movies. They, which is tell it. But so that's part of the generic evangelicalism, but then certain culture war issues rise to the fore.
Mm-hmm.
I could be wrong here. I don't think the mainline church has had the same amalgamation. Methodists know that they come from Wesley and they like to talk about Wesley. Presbyterians like to talk about Calvin and Reformed thought. Mm-hmm. Lutherans are very much Lutherans. So UCC has its own history, which is interesting to dig into. But there are stronger kind of historical ties.
Maybe that's what
in the main line.
Right?
That keeps it.
I think this is what drives me crazy about evangelicalism. Like if I feel like if I go to like a mainline church, like I know why they have a reason for why they do something.
Yes.
Whereas evangelicals sort of have to like reinvent the wheel all the time.
Yeah.
Cause like I remember going to like a progressive evangelical church and they're like, they had communion, but that was just at a table that you was self-serve. And I was like, it drove me insane. Like, no, this is not right.
Yeah.
Going back to your point about being fearless, reactionary, it feels like if I'm understanding what you've read, what you wrote in the book, this culture war type of drivenness, influence, like reaction, certainly, maybe I'm wrong, but certainly I feel like similar things happen in mainline process, especially right now in the political season we're in right now, which goodness knows there's some fairness to. But thinking even bigger picture, it feels like, and I've been talking about this with one of my good friends, Dennis Sanders, like it feels like when all that the opposite is known for is just resisting, there's never any kind of hopeful future.
Yeah.
And eventually people kind of wear out of like resisting and they want like, what's our hopeful future? Like, what are we offering people? And I'm wondering, like, have you seen a similar dynamic, or it seems like you've seen a similar dynamic within Christian evangelical universities? What do you recommend instead?
Okay. This is the version of the question that I get of people say, okay, could you name a fearless university? And my answer is I've got some nominees. I don't know how well they match my image. Mm-hmm. And I won't name them right now. But a quick side note. I had decided while I was waiting to hear from Erdmans, I knew they liked the book, but I didn't know where we were in the process, that what I would do is I would add a chapter that would be a field trip, and I would go and visit like 3 or 4 of these institutions I thought were nominees. Well, when I got the contract on November 1st of 23, I had a February 1st, 24 submission deadline. and the field trip went away.
Yeah.
and so the 9th chapter is my imaginary field trip. But so the central thrust of the book is that there are, and I think I can work this back around to churches.
Yeah.
Central thrust of the church is that there are 2 critical dynamics at play, and they overlap in Christian universities. One is that you got a set of leaders, administrators, trustees, major donors who are insistent on wanting to maintain their separation from the world, the left, the liberals, that's where all that comes in. And so they wind up trying to hold continuity with a past that isn't realistic in terms of what's going on in its surrounding milieu. Okay. The second dynamic is that this generation of students is very different than what those administrators and donors and trustees and denominations see and think. I have this whole litany. I won't go through the whole thing, but a student beginning at a Christian college in the fall of 25 was born in 2007. She doesn't know anything about 9/11.
Yeah.
She was,
barely alive for the recession.
Barely alive, doesn't know much of anything about the Obama administration. She's like in elementary school when Trayvon Martin dies, when Michael Brown dies, you go through that whole list.
Right.
She's 11 when Me Too hits the social, hits at Church 2 following it. She has dealt with school shootings or the fear of school shootings, with concerns about climate change, with political polarization. All of that has happened in her short lifetime.
Right.
And the cell phone in her pocket has been the dynamic through which she engages all these topics, and it has been present her entire life.
Yeah.
So that's the dynamic of the students that are coming in. Even if they're like evangelical students, these are the sentiments they're bringing with them.
So like the norms of like, when we think about the majority, what was the Falwell?
Moral majority.
You mentioned 9/11, like so many of these kind of culture war issues, Teletubbies, if you remember that whole thing, like clueless to her.
And the issues that are of importance to her, diversity, LGBTQ, at least respect, climate change, broad sense of community, legitimate discipleship, are exactly the issues, with the exception of the last one, that the university leadership prides itself in not focusing on. So that's the central crisis of the book. And so the solution to that, which is also going to speak, I think, to what you want to talk about in terms of churches. The solution to that is to center the students' questions as the primary piece of the mission of the university. That there is a question, the alternatives are sort of protecting the brand versus addressing the needs and concerns and questions of today's students. I have a friend, I won't name the institution, but I have a friend who was recently at a kind of recruiting event for interested students. And he told me that the admissions department because there's students and parents present.
Right.
And the admissions department tells the parents that the university has not changed since when they went to school. It was the same institution. And he and I, because he has known about the book since early days, he said, this is just absolutely this is like the absolute inverse of what I'm arguing in the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
and it feels like pretty preposterous to think that they have absolutely not changed, but I can see why you'd say that to a parent. This is where I want to kind of hit to, because I think this is very applicable, at least in my perspective. You talk about centering student questions as the primary mission. So if we think about that in terms of a church context, how do we do that? And it's not necessarily going to be 18 to 22-year-olds in a church context, because they're, the data suggests they're loosely involved with church at that age anyway. But you may get them at the end of high school, you may get them as they're young adults or later young adults, whatever the terminology is now, as they're trying to trickle back and ask some questions. How do you make church so that you're centering these questions, but like not, I hate to use this word, but for lack of a better word, abandoning kind of these central tenets, your core theology. Does that make sense? Like, what do you know?
Yeah. So I think part of the answer is, and I don't know how this works structurally,
right? But
part of the answer is, first of all, legitimizing questions.
Okay.
That's one piece. That it's okay here in this church to say, I'm confused about this. I don't know what I think about this. I don't know how I don't know how to read this passage of the Old Testament. I don't know how to reconcile these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how my lived experience with my neighbors can be connected with my gay neighbors, can be connected to these scripture passages.
Right.
There's an openness to being able to at least acknowledge that those are legitimate questions.
Yeah.
I don't think that's all kind of talk back issues in churches. I'm not sure that structurally works, but I think there is a mode that preachers can demonstrate that they have their own questions and the questions are okay and that we're not afraid of questions. So that's part of it. A second component is to think about what it means to be truly focused on Jesus, not just Jesus's words or Jesus's ministry, but the broader theological understanding of the incarnation. How do we talk about God with us, and how do we talk about the broader theological? We just at our church did a small group study on Philippians. And so you got the whole Philippians 2.
Yes.
Just massive, important passage, which, kind of creates this context, which isn't just Jesus was a good guy who got along with people. This is, again, to go back to the sort of stereotype of mainliners.
Right.
There's depth there about what the person Jesus means. A third thing I would ask, I think it's a third, maybe it's a sub point of the first, or maybe it's the major point and the thing I said was a sub point. I once was asked to give a little staff devotional talk to at one of my colleges during the summer. And what I wanted talking about was what it meant to have, what it meant to trust God. And that so often we get ourselves in the evangelical world into this position that says, if we don't hold the line right here, then we haven't been true to God.
Yeah.
And you want to say, there are days where that skates really close to idolatry.
Yeah.
That you think somehow that you're protecting God from difficult conversations. And I don't think God needs to be protected from difficult conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why that relates to that first point.
Yeah.
And even with my other point about Jesus. I mean, challenging kind of, what do we do with this? Jesus, here's what this person says. What do we do? Do we do this or do we do that? Those weren't easy. And that's part of the dynamic.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I'm thinking too, as we think about maybe more practically speaking too, when you think about certainly in higher ed, you can speak better this than I can't, but I'm just thinking like I have a degree on my wall that I did entirely online. Most of my seminary was completed online. It seems like the shift has been, practically speaking, to like online alternative sort of education models. I don't know if you want to speak any more to that, and thinking again, applying that to church, like how do we need to perhaps re-envision like the structural elements of church?
Yeah. Let's see. First of all, let me say something about the non-traditional programming at colleges.
Yes.
The degree completion program I was part of, or online programming, or graduate programming. The schools made the move to do that because it was financially important to do so.
Mm-hmm.
But to argue that those programs carry the same mission components that happens with an 18 to 22-year-old residential student is just impossible to articulate. It just doesn't.
Because even when I was doing my master's divinity, I had to be on campus for a few classes.
Yeah.
There's a huge better, I felt so much more connected and engaged, even when it was a week-long class.
Yeah. Churches already have the problem of fostering spectatorship.
Right.
I mean, the best thing we do at our church every Sunday is the 8 minutes we spend in the passing of the peace, which really involves wandering all around the congregation and not just talking to people next to you. People just get up and move all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
It is really as a friend of mine from years ago said, it is the remembering of the congregation.
Yeah.
That's just impossible to do in a church of 750.
Right.
And it is absolutely impossible to do by typing in the chat line on the online service to say, oh, good to see you all on the screen, which you can't see because the camera is only focused at the front anyway.
Right.
So, that becomes problematic. I think it has a place. I think one of the things we learned during COVID is that it's a nice fallback for people who can't travel to the congregation, or as I happen to know, from people I know at church, it's, we got up a little late and so we're just going to watch today and I get that, but there comes a point where if that's all you do, you're not part of the congregation in the same fashion. My dissertation, 40 years ago, was about people who regularly attend church and don't join.
Mm-hmm.
How prevalent was that? Do some interviews. Why is that? Talk to some pastors. What do they think about that? That was the dissertation. But early on, I had to decide what I thought about the relationship between kind of being in community versus being on the rolls.
Mm.
And it didn't take me long to figure out that being in community is the primary driver of congregational life. So being online, only online, is a step removed from that. And a step removed from that is being on the rolls and going at Christmas and Easter. So that's...
I'm thinking too, somewhere I have it, there's a book coming out from Think Baker, The Strategically Small Church. Thinking economically too about this, and I'm sure you can speak to this, you kind of already have from the Christian University perspective of going online was somewhat about scale, I imagine, and financial, because again, you can only from a campus perspective only house and sustain so many students. Similarly, like I feel like certainly in an evangelical church, the mega church model works because it's like financially viable. Like you can keep bringing in people, and your ministry staff doesn't really have to expand exponentially. Whereas like this, I often say this, like the classic 20, 30 years ago church that we think of, like the 150 member church, like that's almost that doesn't exist now. And it's really hard to maintain because of giving levels decreasing.
You're right that the metrics have shifted downward.
Right.
But I used to argue that up to 125 maybe,
right,
you can maintain the metaphor of the church as family.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gets really dicey from 125 until I don't know, 250, 300, where you're big enough to have subcomponents.
Right.
But there is that, what happens when you're too big. And then when you're very big, when you're really big and you got subcomponents, one of my favorite little quotes, and this goes back, to the early, about 2011, I think. But one of the books that Robert Putnam wrote, The Bowling Alone Guy,
Mm-hmm.
was about kind of community organizations.
Right.
I used it at a class. And one of the community organizations they studied was Saddleback.
Mm-hmm.
And he had this little throwaway line that there were 152 people on the mountain biking email list for Saddleback.
Mm-hmm.
And I always liked that image because that says where community exists in the really large megachurch.
Right.
It exists in interest pockets.
Yeah.
Or in the neighborhood small group. I mean, and the loyalty is there much more than the loyalty is to the institution. There is a parallel there, by the way, to the non-traditional programming at Christian universities.
Mm-hmm.
Is that if you talk to people who do a degree completion or who do a master's in divinity in this online program with a cohort, your loyalty is much more to the people in the cohort than it is to the institution.
I mean, that really speaks to like the broader cultural dynamics we are in right now, right? Where people have far less institutional loyalty. It's far more relational, connectional based. So I guess what do you advise universities? What do you advise institutions? Where they're thinking of like, we know we can't necessarily like sustain our model through a purely, in the university space on campus, in whatever the terminology is.
Yeah.
Similarly for churches, for other institutions.
One of several answers I have to that is my argument is that the future of the Fearless Christian University involves a willingness to try to meet the needs of the rising generation, even though the rising generation, only 9% of them are white evangelicals. The interests of Gen Z, the need for belonging, the need for security, the need for their lives to have meaning, the need to have impact, all of those things are those are the kinds of things that residential Christian universities can provide.
I mean, frankly, what Christianity provides.
What
right?
Christianity provides, yes, to kind of move on to that.
Yeah.
So to recognize that we are addressing the felt needs of people, not to prioritize the individualization of that, because that becomes problematic on its own, but yes, to say we invite the questions, we recognize the needs, we are here to provide belonging and importance and meaning, I think is possible. That requires a willingness to kind of step out of the past zombie patterns.
Yes.
And just rather than saying, no, this is an old argument in the sociology of religion, but is the question about believing versus belonging.
Right.
And if believing is primary, and you are welcome in this place as long as you line up, then that's going to be a challenge. And if belonging is what's important and believing comes along tailing that, then it's a different dynamic for the church.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, as I'm writing down believing and belonging, Jeff Cuse, who I had on a few episodes past, did a lot of work on this. Maybe I'm too optimistic here. You can push back, but I feel like this is possible. Going back to that point about maintaining ethos and theological values, like it's possible to say like, hey, this is what your felt needs are. You're looking for purpose. You're looking for connection. It's just about messaging. It's like, is that too simple? Is that too pie in the sky?
Would say more about what you mean by just messaging.
Like, it's reframing to say like, so it's like in my tradition, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, where I'm ordained in, like our big thing is the open table, communion, blah, blah, blah. Like the central component of a worship service in the disciples gathering, and it's funny, even when like disciples clergy, like, you've had what they call worship is like, we've had communion, so we know we have worship, Yeah. It's funny because like in the evangelical space, like they've had worship when they
do the music. Yeah.
Right. Like they've worshiped. But I feel like there's a way to, like when we get stuck on like, well, we have to have a central table and we have to have elders up there and we have to have, the elder give a reflection, like versus like saying, what are the ethos and values of the table? Everyone being welcome, people included, God's love and grace is for all, like translating that, and not that I want to get rid of the table.
Let me add one piece to that.
Yes.
Years ago, I realized that I had been socialized to see communion as this was with passing the little trays,
right? But
to see communion as a very introspective moment.
Yes.
Let me take communion and go dig down deep inside.
Yeah.
And even with the little trays, I came to recognize the real miraculous thing is to be aware of all of these other people in the room sipping the little cup and taking the little piece of whatever that is at the same time.
Yeah.
Or now, in our congregation, we go forward to take communion. The pastor names us, and I've helped before, and so I know that the dynamic is, you are named, and you are very aware not just that this is communion and the table is open, but this is Loren taking communion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm even, we are communing at the table with Jesus and each other at that moment. Mm-hmm. And so that notion of belonging gets communicated. The word came to mind is programmatically, which is horrible. Institutionally, in practice is, and I think it's more than just messaging.
But you're right, because you're getting at, it's a way of saying you belong through the tradition, but there's intentionality behind it.
Yes.
Well, I want to keep talking about this, but we're running out of time. Let's take a quick break. We're back. We got the dogs riled up. So, John, we only have a few more minutes. I know you got to run. So let's take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to take them. So I don't know if you want to think about this, like maybe not from the Pope, since that's the traditional question I ask you, but from your context, like if you were like, I don't know, what's the president, or you could like speak for all Christian universities or Christian institutions, like what are a couple things, some things you'd want to do in that a single day?
Oh, in a single day.
Yeah, you don't get a full.
Oh,
you don't
man.
get a full year. You got a day.
let me answer this way.
Yeah.
What, a lot of people say, oh, well, do you really expect all these Christian universities to change their positions? And I say, no. Give me one.
Mm-hmm.
Give me one for proof of concept.
Yeah.
Let's find one and let's have the conversation about what it means to be fearless. So that the last chapter of the book that I said was my made up field trip tells the story of two universities, one, both of which I made up. One of which has fully embraced what I'm describing.
Right.
And I described some of what goes into the components of what makes that work. And then the second one was one that would like to do that and is living in the shadow of another very conservative university that I nicknamed Driscoll University, and wants to know how not to do that. And so is kind of moving the other direction. So I think the first move is what I would want in a day is to ask Christian university presidents to commit to seriously engaging the questions their students have. And that means they'd have to go talk to them and they'd have to learn. And it's not just the subset of people they think are, the right kinds of students, but just like the absolute opposite of that. Start at the other end and spend a day with the most troubled and questioning student you could find. And then imagine what it means if the university was organized to see that student deepen in faith and character and learning and competence and ethical standing and all of that. So that's...
I feel like this could work in church too. If you're like, hey, we're going to do a sermon series on like the biggest questions, and talk about like where we believe, not again from an open perspective, not like this is the law, but have like an open, this is why we think what we think type of thing.
The alternative to that I'm thinking of, this goes back a few decades, but James Dobson's what wives wish their husbands knew about women.
Yeah.
And where that book came from is he would go to his big conferences and he had a preset list of issues and then asked them to rank order them in the survey and then wrote about what they said. But he came with the issues already. So if I play off that, the issue is not to say, well, what are the key questions? Here's what I, as the pastor, think the key questions are.
Oh, that's good.
But you actually go and talk to the most...
That's good.
Marginal person in the congregation and say, what are your key questions? And speak to those.
Boy, this is good. I want to keep talking about that, about time. Theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Yeah, that was a good question. If we're having dinner with anybody, I want dinner with the Apostle Peter and John Wesley.
Peter and Wesley.
I think that would be a good conversation about kind of how they think about faith and rigidity and openness and all that.
Okay, here's another loaded question that you have to answer shortly, I suppose. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
It depends. History will remember that either this is the point at which we were really committed to being a pluralistic culture that recognized the inherent dignity and value of all people, or this is the time where a subgroup of powerful people dominated and everybody else is left to fend for themselves.
Yeah. What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
Is more Jesus, more community, less Machianism, less dividing everybody into good or evil, more of a celebration of the Imago Dei and our notions of common grace as they are lived out.
Well, where can people connect with you, get the book, all that?
The book's available from all your favorite all your favorite places. you could just look up the Fearless Christian University from Erdman's or Barnes & Noble or Amazon or your local bookseller, or probably not your local bookseller because it's a little niche.
Yeah.
The other thing to find out is I write a Substack 3 days a week with the very profound title of John's newsletter. Because that's what I did when I jumped onto Substack and haven't changed it. And I write usually Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays about issues ranging from higher ed to politics to religion to obviously Christian higher education or to whatever book I just read.
Okay, we'll have to make sure we get your Substack in the show notes.
Yeah.
And then when we share this. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
Thanks for coming over to my house. Thanks
Absolutely.
For dogs.
The dogs are great.
Folks in here, the clicking and clapping, but really appreciate it. And we always leave folks with the word peace. So may God's peace be with you.
And you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.